In 2011, Adam Fromal of Bleacher Report ranked Kobe Bryant the 9th greatest defensive two-guard of all time. Fromal ranked Bryant behind 8 players who had fewer all-defense selections than Bryant had with 12. Fromal's explanation was that while there was no doubting that Bryant was a great defender, he couldn't escape the feeling that Bryant was a bit overrated because of his offensive exploits. Of course, he never elaborates on why the defensive reputations of other awesome scorers, like George Gervin and Alex English, did not similarly benefit. The thing is, of the major awards given to reward NBA excellence, the all-defense team has historically been perhaps the least subjective of them. Until the 2014 season, the all-defense team was selected by the coaches, the people that had to scheme against Kobe. It would seem to me that at some point during his 12-year reign as one of the great defenders in the league, players would start to report to their coaches that they could expose and get by Bryant. It would seem like coaches who spent hours and hours viewing film of every single game would start to notice that Bryant was losing a step, as they did in 2013, because he was in fact starting to lose a step. During Kobe Bryant's career, 51 players from the Western Conference scored 40 points in a playoff game. None of them that played Kobe's position did so against the Lakers. By position, I mean players 6'5" to 6'7" that played guard or swing guard or forward. Now, if you were to distribute all the players in the NBA in 2006, the midpoint of Bryant's career, if you were to distribute those players by height, about 20% of them stood between 6'5" and 6'7". Now, Bryant often guarded and shut down smaller guards, but it's not fair to say that Allen Iverson, for example, played the same position as Bryant. Among players 6'5" and 6'7" that played his position, only 5, Richard Hamilton, Jalen Rose, Manu Ginobili, Ray Allen, and Scottie Pippen, went for 30 against Kobe in the playoffs in winning efforts. Now, I'm counting Rose at 6'8" and not counting Barkley at 6'6", because Barkley clearly was not a wing player and Rose clearly was. Bryant played in 220 career playoff games. Again, no player scored 40 on Bryant, and only 5 players scored 30 or more in winning efforts. Keep in mind, this is the Western Conference. During Bryant's playoff career, players scored 30 or more in the playoffs 286 times. Now, Allen Iverson famously dropped 48 in Game 1 of the 2001 Finals. While Bryant often defended and shut down smaller guards, it's important to note that Bryant's defensive assignment that night was Aaron McKie. Iverson scored most of his points on Derek Fisher, who Coach Phil Jackson thought was a bit slow that night. Iverson, with Bryant guarding him the rest of the series, shot under 40%. And to tell you the truth, that Bryant guarded Iverson at all was a testament to Bryant's defensive acumen. Iverson was 6 inches smaller. To get an apples-to-apples comparison of how Bryant stacked up against some of the greatest defenders in NBA history, in terms of game situations that definitely mattered in the scheme of an NBA season. So I looked at great defenders who lost in the playoffs while giving up 30 or more points by a player that played their position. One could argue that a great player might hide or take it easy on defense throughout the regular season. A great player could also accumulate defensive win shares against inferior competition over the course of a season. It would seem that the playoffs would mitigate those factors. I wanted to look at situations where the innocent player, lost the game. It's one thing for a defense to decide not to overcommit defensive resources to stopping a great player, knowing that victory can be achieved as long as said player does not also get teammates involved. It's quite another for a player to get so hot that he is able to put his team on his back and carry them to victory. In such a scenario, as it started to emerge over the course of an important game, a great defender would be expected to slow down the focal point of the opponent's offense. LeBron James has played in 260 playoff games. 14 times has a player that played LeBron's position scored 30 points or more in winning efforts against a LeBron James team. Carmelo Anthony, Paul Pierce, Boban Marjanovic, Jimmy Butler, Carmelo Anthony, Caron Butler, Paul George twice, and Kevin Durant, a total of 14 times. During Michael Jordan's career, 229 Eastern Conference players scored 30 or more. Remarkably, no player that played his position scored 30 or more on Michael Jordan during the entirety of the Bulls' run in the 90s. However, before Scottie Pippen emerged as a great defensive player, Jordan had already been established as an elite defender, winning the Defensive Player of the Year award in 1988. By the end of the 1989 season, Jordan had only played in 37 playoff games. Ron Harper, his future teammate, would go for 30 twice in successive playoff winning efforts in 1988 and in 89 against Jordan. Tony Allen was all defense for 7 years, from 2011 to 2017. He played in 56 playoff games during that time. 3 players, Russell Westbrook, Steph Curry, and Reggie Jackson, scored 30 or more against Memphis in winning efforts. Keep in mind, Allen is backed up by Marc Gasol, who was the Defensive Player of the Year in 2013. Bruce Bowen played in 107 playoff games. He was all defense for 8 years. He was backed up by Tim Duncan, one of the greatest defenders ever. Kobe scored 30 or more 7 times in winning efforts during that time. Carmelo Anthony and Michael Finley did as well. Bobby Jones played in 125 playoff games. Only one player, Larry Bird, scored 30 or more on Jones, but Bird did it 3 times. Now, on a ratio basis, Jones at 3 out of 125 is great, but not as good as Bryant, and Jones is considered one of the greatest defenders ever. Gary Payton had 2 players go for 30 on him. Rex Chapman and Mitch Richmond gave the glove at least 42 and 37 respectively. Nick Van Exel also went for 34, but Van Exel is 6'1". It's a questionable case because Van Exel was most definitely a point guard. I'm not sure who else was supposed to guard Van Exel other than Payton. Payton's 129 playoff games gives him a ratio that is better than Bryant's if you don't count Van Exel. Sidney Moncrief played 93 playoff games. 6 players scored 30 or more on him in winning efforts. To be fair, Gus Johnson was responsible for 3 of those games during the 1980 Western Conference semifinals. Moncrief didn't play over 30 minutes in any of those games. Counting the other 3, Moncrief surrendered 30 points in winning efforts roughly every 30 playoff games. The great Kawhi Leonard played 124 playoff games with the Spurs, Toronto Raptors, and currently the LA Clippers. He gave up 30-point performances against Klay Thompson, Jimmy Butler, Luka Doncic, and LeBron James 4 times. He also gave up a couple of performances to Kevin Durant, and I guess I'll take this time to explain my thinking on Kevin Durant. Kevin Durant gave quite a few of these players big-time performances. my difficulty with Kevin Durant, as well as Giannis Antetokounmpo, was that it was difficult to place them. So I just kind of actually put them to the side a little bit, actually. I really didn't know what position was supposed to. I guess Kevin Durant would have to be a small forward, and maybe Giannis as well. But I'll just add that caveat. But for the purposes of keeping this conversation tight, I only assigned players that clearly played the player's position. In the case of Kawhi Leonard, that would be those four players. And LeBron did it, like I said, 4 times. Of course, we know that Kawhi did a tremendous job against Giannis in the 2019 Eastern Conference or semifinals. So that might have been a feather in his cap, but for the purposes of keeping this clean, we'll just say that he gave up 7 30-point performances in 124 games. Scottie Pippen is generally considered to be one of the greatest defensive wing players in NBA history. As I mentioned before, as teammates with Michael Jordan, remarkably, no player that played Jordan or Pippen's position scored 30 points on them in winning efforts during the entirety of their 90s run. So for the purposes of this discussion and to get an apples-to-apples comparison, what I did was I looked at Pippen's performances without Michael Jordan. In 30 playoff games without Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen only allowed one player, who happened to be Kobe Bryant, to score more than 30 on him. Now, let me say this about Draymond Green. I didn't include Draymond Green, even though he's 6'6", mainly because I do believe that his position is that of a post defender. He typically plays the small ball 5. He was the starting power forward on all of the Golden State championship teams, and really to the extent that he plays, that he defends wing players. The Warriors play the switch everything defense, and I just don't think that it's fair to compare that type of player to a player that routinely defended individual players throughout the majority of a game. Man defense type wing player. So I didn't include Draymond Green for that reason. The point on all of this is that each of these great defenders allowed more great performances in high pressure situations more frequently than Bryant. Bryant's ratio of giving up 30 in a game only once every 44 playoff games was the best on this list of some of the greatest defensive players in NBA history. And in my opinion, that makes Bryant the greatest on-ball defender in NBA history.